The MSNBC studio lights felt hotter than usual. Or maybe that was just the anger radiating off Representative Jasmine Crockett as she sat across from anchor Chris Hayes. It was a Friday afternoon in late September, and Washington was buzzing with the kind of chaos that had become all too familiar. Another government shutdown looming. Millions of Americans wondering if their paychecks would arrive. Federal workers preparing to go without pay. And SNAP benefits that millions of families depended on hanging in the balance. But what had Crockett fired up wasn't just the shutdown itself. It was what Speaker Mike Johnson had announced just 2 hours earlier. Congress would be recessing for a 2-week vacation while negotiations remained stalled, leaving the American people to deal with the consequences of congressional dysfunction. Chris leaned forward, sensing the energy shift in his usually composed guest. Congresswoman Crockett, Speaker Johnson just announced that the House will recess until October 16th, despite no resolution on the funding bill. Your reaction? Crockett's jaw tightened visibly before she spoke. And when she did, her words came out measured but loaded with barely contained frustration. Chris, let me tell you what's happening right now in my district in Dallas. I've got a constituent named Patricia. She's 68 years old, worked as a nurse for 43 years before retiring. Her SNAP benefits that help her buy groceries, they're about to stop. She called my office this morning in tears, asking if she needs to choose between her blood pressure medication and eating this month. And you're asking me how I feel about Mike Johnson taking a vacation. The response was immediate and visceral. Chris's eyebrows raised slightly. The production crew in the control room stopped what they were doing. And on social media, where the interview was streaming live, the clip was already being shared thousands of times per minute. Crockett wasn't done. She leaned forward, speaking directly into the camera as if addressing not just the viewers, but Johnson himself. For weeks now, the speaker has been telling the American people that we need to make tough choices about spending, that we can't afford to keep funding these programs, that we have to be fiscally responsible. But apparently, being fiscally responsible doesn't mean staying in Washington to do your job. Apparently, tough choices don't apply to congressional vacation schedules. Her voice rose slightly, passion replacing the initial measured tone. We've got federal workers who are going to miss their rent payments. We've got military families wondering how they're going to feed their kids. We've got small businesses that depend on federal contracts about to go under. And Mike Johnson's solution? See you in 2 weeks. Figure it out yourselves. Hope you don't starve while I'm gone. Chris tried to interject to provide some procedural context, but Crockett held up her hand. No, Chris, let me finish this because somebody needs to say it. The speaker keeps talking about the dignity of work, about Americans pulling themselves up by their bootstraps, about personal responsibility. But where's his personal responsibility? Where's the dignity in walking away from your job when millions of Americans are depending on you to do it? The interview continued for another 8 minutes, with Crockett systematically dismantling every justification Johnson had offered for the recess. By the time it ended, her phone was exploding with texts. Her social media mentions had gone into the tens of thousands. And news outlets across the country were preparing their evening segments around what was already being called Crockett's shutdown, call-out. Before we dive into what happened after that, interview, the media firestorm, Johnson's response, and how this confrontation exposed the massive disconnect between Congress and the people they're supposed to serve, make sure you hit that subscribe button. You're about to see how one Congresswoman's refusal to stay quiet might have just changed the entire conversation around government shutdowns. Drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from, because this story is just getting started. Within an hour of the MSNBC interview ending, Speaker Mike Johnson's office released a statement. It was carefully worded, politically calculated, designed to sound reasonable while saying essentially nothing. The statement read, Speaker Johnson remains committed to reaching a bipartisan funding solution. The brief recess will allow members to return to their districts, hear from constituents, and return to Washington ready to negotiate in good faith. It was standard political spin, the kind of non-answer that usually lets politicians avoid real accountability. But Johnson and his communications team had badly miscalculated 2 things. First, they underestimated how angry Americans were about the shutdown. And second, they had no idea that Jasmine Crockett had only just begun. That evening, Crockett held an impromptu press conference outside the Capitol building. It wasn't a formal scheduled event with prepared remarks and a polished backdrop. It was raw, unscripted, and all the more powerful because of it. She stood on the Capitol steps with a handful of other House Democrats who decided to join her. But make no mistake, this was Crockett's moment, and everyone knew it. "I just read Speaker Johnson's statement," she began, holding up her phone with the statement displayed on screen. "And I have to say, it's one of the most insulting things I've ever read." She looked directly into the MSNBC camera that had rushed over to cover the presser. "The Speaker says he wants members to go home and hear from constituents. Let me tell you what my constituents are saying, Mr. Speaker. They're saying they can't afford to wait 2 weeks. They're saying their landlords don't care about congressional recesses. They're saying their kids get hungry every day and not just on days when it's convenient for Congress to be in session." She pulled out a folder, that trademark Crockett move that had become familiar to anyone who'd watched her in action. Inside were printed emails, handwritten letters, and text messages from constituents. "Let me read you some of these," she said, flipping to the first page. "This is from Marcus, a TSA agent at DFW Airport. He writes, 'Congresswoman, I've worked every government shutdown for the last 15 years. Every time they tell us we'll get back pay eventually, but my electricity company doesn't accept eventually. My daughter needs braces now, not eventually. Please make them understand we're real people, not political pawns.'" Crockett looked up from the letter, emotion clear in her voice but controlled, focused. "Marcus isn't asking for a handout. He's asking to be paid for work he's already done. He's asking Congress to do its job so he can keep doing his. And Speaker Johnson's answer is, take a vacation and we'll figure it out later." She moved to the next letter. This one is from Sandra, a single mother of 3 in Oak Cliff. She writes, "My SNAP benefits are supposed to reload on October 1st. That's the only way I can buy groceries for my kids. I work full-time at Walmart, but it's not enough to cover rent, utilities, and food. If those benefits don't come, I don't know what I'm going to do. I don't know how to explain to my 6-year-old why there's no food in the house when Mommy works every day." Crockett's voice shook slightly now, genuine emotion breaking through. Sandra doesn't need her Congresswoman to go home and listen to her concerns. She needs her Congresswoman to stay here and fix the problem. She needs Speaker Johnson to do his job instead of taking a vacation while she figures out how to feed her children. The reporters assembled were frantically taking notes, cameras rolling, producers already cutting clips for their evening broadcasts. Crockett moved through several more constituent stories: a veteran waiting on VA benefits, a small business owner whose federal contract payments were frozen, a cancer patient whose NIH-funded treatment program was about to shut down. Each story was specific, documented, real. This wasn't abstract political theater. This was the human cost of congressional dysfunction. Then Crockett shifted gears, and her tone changed from emotional advocate to prosecutorial cross-examiner. "But let's talk about the Speaker's justification," she said, her voice hardening. "He claims this recess will allow for good faith negotiations. Let me tell you what good faith looks like, Mr. Speaker. Good faith is staying at the negotiating table until you reach a deal. Good faith is missing your vacation instead of making federal workers miss their paychecks. Good faith is treating this crisis with the urgency it deserves." She pointed back toward the Capitol building. "Right now in there, we have everything we need to solve this. We have meeting rooms. We have staff. We have the constitutional authority to pass a funding bill tonight if leadership wanted to. The only thing we're missing is the political will from Speaker Johnson to keep us here and force a vote." A reporter shouted a question. "Congresswoman, isn't this just how the process works? Don't negotiations sometimes require breaks?" Crockett wheeled on the reporter, not with anger, but with the kind of sharp response that comes from someone who spent years in courtrooms. "Does your landlord give you a break when rent is due? Does the grocery store let you take a 2-week break from paying for food? When my constituents can't make their bills, they don't get to just walk away and hope it resolves itself. They have to figure it out right then. Congress should be held to the same standard." Another reporter jumped in. "What do you want Speaker Johnson to do specifically?" Crockett didn't hesitate. "I want him to cancel the recess. I want him to keep the House in session. I want him to bring a clean continuing resolution to the floor for a vote tonight. And if he won't do that, I want him to publicly explain to every federal worker, every SNAP recipient, every American who depends on a functioning government why his vacation is more important than their survival." The press conference continued for another 20 minutes, with Crockett fielding questions and systematically dismantling every procedural excuse for the recess. But the damage, or depending on your perspective, the impact, had already been done. The clips were spreading like wildfire across social media. Crockett slams Johnson was trending on Twitter. News websites were updating their homepages with breaking news banners. And in living rooms across America, people who normally didn't pay much attention to congressional procedure were suddenly very interested in what this Congresswoman from Texas was saying. By the next morning, the story had exploded beyond what anyone anticipated. Saturday morning political shows led with it. The Washington Post ran a front-page story titled "Shutdown Politics," as Speaker vacations, one Congresswoman revolts. The New York Times published an analysis piece examining the growing disconnect between congressional schedules and constituent needs. Even Fox News, typically aligned with Republican leadership, couldn't entirely ignore the story, though they tried to frame it as Democratic grandstanding. But the real pressure wasn't coming from media coverage. It was coming from the ground up. Constituent phone lines in Republican districts were lighting up with angry voters demanding to know why their representatives were taking a vacation during a crisis. Social media was flooded with stories from Americans impacted by the shutdown, all using the hashtag #JarkCancelTheRecess. That had emerged organically from Crockett's press conference, progressive. Organizations mobilized quickly, organizing protests outside House Republican offices across the country. Veterans groups issued statements supporting Crockett's call to stay in session. Federal employee unions called for emergency sessions. Even some traditionally conservative business groups expressed concern about the economic impact of a prolonged shutdown paired with congressional absence. By Sunday evening, cracks were starting to show in Republican unity. Several moderate House Republicans gave interviews saying they were open to discussing staying in session if it meant reaching a faster resolution. A few even directly criticized the recess decision, though carefully avoiding direct attacks on Johnson himself. But the Speaker's office remained defiant. A spokesperson told reporters, "Speaker Johnson stands by his decision. Members need time to consult with their districts before making critical funding decisions." It was a massive miscalculation, and Jasmine Crockett was about to make them regret it. Monday morning, Crockett appeared on MSNBC's Morning Joe. She arrived armed with more documents, more constituent accounts, and a clear breakdown of how much the shutdown was costing Americans for every day Congress stayed on recess. But she also brought something unexpected, a legislative proposal. "I'm introducing a bill this morning," she announced, called the No Vacation During Shutdown Act. It's simple. If the government shuts down, Congress doesn't recess. Period. No vacations, no district sessions, no fundraising trips. You stay in Washington until you fix the crisis you caused. The hosts asked if she believed it would pass. Crockett smiled, but it wasn't friendly. It was the smile of someone who'd just laid a trap. "I don't know if it'll pass," she admitted. "But I do know that every member of Congress will have to go on record, either for it or against it. And I know every American watching will see exactly where their representatives' priorities lie." The proposal was politically brilliant. It forced Republicans into an impossible spot: vote for it and admit the recess was wrong, or vote against it and prove they valued vacation over Americans' well-being. Either way, Crockett had seized control of the narrative. This wasn't just about one break anymore. It was about Congress's accountability to the people it served. By Tuesday, pressure on Johnson had become unbearable. Republican members called his office, worried about the backlash. Donors asked awkward questions about optics. Conservative pundits began hinting maybe the recess was a mistake. But Johnson, prideful and cornered, refused to publicly retreat. Instead, his office floated ideas of a shortened recess or reconvening early if needed. Crockett saw the gap and struck fast. In a statement Tuesday afternoon, she declared, "Speaker Johnson's half measures and empty promises aren't enough. Americans can't do their jobs halfway. Federal workers can't feed their families on maybe and possibly. Either Congress is in session working to solve this crisis or it's not. There's no middle ground when people are hurting." The statement ended with a public challenge. "I will be at my desk in Congress every day this recess. I invite Speaker Johnson to join me." It was a strategic masterstroke. If Johnson stayed away, Crockett could spend 2 weeks spotlighting his absence. If he returned, she'd get what she wanted: Congress back in session. Either way, she'd won. Wednesday morning delivered the unexpected breakthrough. A group of 12 House Republicans, mostly moderates from swing districts, announced they were siding with Crockett's demand to cancel the recess. In a joint statement, they wrote, While we may disagree with Representative Crockett on many issues, she's right about this. Our constituents are suffering, and we should be in Washington working for them, not on vacation. The dam had cracked. By noon, Johnson's office confirmed he would make a statement that evening. When cameras went live at 6 p.m., Johnson looked weary and defeated. His prepared remarks tried to frame the decision as his own idea, but everyone watching knew the truth. After consulting with members and leadership, Johnson said, voice stripped of its usual authority, we've decided to shorten the recess. The House will reconvene Monday, October 7th, to continue funding negotiations. It was a partial win, cutting the break from 2 weeks to 1, but not the total reversal Crockett had sought. Yet the real victory wasn't in the timing. It was in what the fight had revealed. That evening, Crockett joined MSNBC to respond. I'll give the Speaker credit for at least admitting Congress should be working during a crisis, she said. But let's be honest about what happened. Speaker Johnson was prepared to take a 2-week vacation while Americans went hungry. He only reversed course because the public demanded it, because my colleagues on both sides demanded it, and because the political cost of his indifference became too high to ignore. She leaned forward, eyes on the camera. This should never have been a debate. The idea that Congress would recess during a shutdown should be unthinkable. But dysfunction has become so normal that it took national outrage to make leadership do the bare minimum. That's not leadership. Americans deserve better, and I'm going to keep fighting until they get it. When asked what would happen once Congress reconvened, Crockett was calm but resolute. When we return, I'll immediately push for a clean continuing resolution. No policy writers, no poison pills, just a bill to keep the government running while we negotiate longer-term solutions. And if Speaker Johnson tries more political games, if he holds Americans hostage to his agenda, I'll be there calling it out. Someone in Congress has to remember who we serve. The following week, as Congress returned early and rushed to pass funding, the entire narrative had shifted. What began as another shutdown crisis had become a reckoning over congressional responsibility. Editorials nationwide praised Crockett for putting people before politics. Even conservative voices admitted Johnson had misplayed his hand. Progressive groups hailed her as a new kind of leader, one willing to fight openly for working families. The shutdown ended with a compromise resolution extending funding through December. But the true story wasn't the legislation. It was what Jasmine Crockett had exposed about the widening gap between Congress and the American people. The question now wasn't whether another shutdown would come. It was inevitable in this era of dysfunction. The real question was whether anyone else in Congress would have the courage Jasmine Crockett showed to call it out when it did. If this breakdown of how Jasmine Crockett forced congressional leadership to cancel their vacation during a national crisis resonated with you, be sure to like this video and subscribe for more fearless political analysis. Comment below on which issue you want us to tackle next. Share this with anyone tired of politicians putting convenience over people's survival. Your engagement drives this channel forward.